My husband filed for divorce because he said I only lived for my sick mother, and he didn't want to waste his youth. My kitchen table basically turned into a medical command center the year everything went sideways, which sounds dramatic, but I promise it was just piles of receipts. Pill bottles, insurance paperwork, and half-drunk coffee mugs squeezed in between my kids' homework and their cereal bowls. I used to joke that our dining room had been downgraded to a waiting room with snacks. It was easier to joke about it than admit that I was terrified all the time. My name is Renee, by the way, and if we were actually sitting at that table right now, I'd probably be apologizing for the mess while shoving a basket of clean but unfolded laundry out of the way so you could put your elbows down. That is what my life felt like back then. One long apology for a situation I did not create but somehow had to manage. I had been with my husband for around 12 years, married for roughly 10, and we had twins who were 8 and somehow always sticky even right after a bath. Both our families lived in the same general area, all very proud of the fact that nobody had ever moved more than an hour away in 3 generations, which used to feel comforting and later started to feel like a trap. The year everything started, my mother got sick. Not the kind of sick where you rest for a week and complain about it. The kind where doctors use words like chronic and aggressive and talk very calmly while your ears are ringing. It was a blood thing, complicated and ugly, and even with insurance, there were copays and special medications and appointments 3 times a week. As an only child, it was basically unspoken that I'd be the one driving her, sitting with her, talking to nurses, and memorizing every single side effect sheet they handed us. My father is not a monster. He just shuts down emotionally when things get scary, which is a nice way of saying he became a ghost who still walked around the house. So I did what I always do. I made a schedule, I rearranged my work hours, and I told myself it was temporary. I worked as a front desk coordinator at a small medical office. Yes, the irony of spending all day around other people's health problems and then going to the hospital at night did not escape me. The job was a mix of answering phones, arguing with insurance reps, and telling people who were already scared that they had to wait a little longer. And then I would clock out and go do a less paid, more emotionally intense version of the same thing for my own mother. Some nights I slept in one of those horrible reclining chairs in her room, the kind that look like they were designed by someone who actively hates backs. Before the diagnosis, my husband and I had been talking about moving out of state. He had been offered a position with more responsibility and better pay at a branch office in another region, and he had this whole fantasy about how we would get a bigger house, and the twins would grow up with better schools, and I would maybe go back to study something I actually liked. We had been planning it quietly, like a little exciting secret. During those first weeks of my mother's treatment, that plan went from exciting to impossible so fast it gave me whiplash. At first, he said all the right things. He told me we could revisit the move later, that my mother needed me, that family came first. He held me when I cried in the kitchen late at night, when everyone else was asleep and the house finally went quiet. But the more weeks passed, the more his words and his eyes stopped matching. He started looking at the calendar like it had personally betrayed him. Every time I reminded him about a new test or a last-minute appointment, I could feel this tiny flinch in him, like I had just canceled his birthday. By the time spring rolled around, he was getting snappy about little things that never bothered him before. I would be talking about my mother's latest lab results, and he would interrupt to say that my father needed to start doing more, that it was not normal for us to carry everything. He was not wrong about my father, to be honest, but the timing felt like a knife. I was exhausted and scared, and he was worried about fairness in the chore chart. One night after the twins went to bed, we had this argument in the living room where he said, in this flat voice, that he felt like our entire life had turned into my mother's illness, and he did not even recognize our marriage anymore. I remember sitting there on the couch, clutching a throw pillow like it could keep me upright, trying to explain that I did not ask for any of this. My mother did not ask to get sick just to annoy him. He rubbed his face and said he knew that, but he was drowning too. I tried to offer compromises that did not exist, like suggesting we get a home health aide that we could not afford or somehow split myself into 2 people. The conversation went in circles until we were both too tired to keep going and ended the night in that weird, cold silence where you share a bed but feel like you are on opposite sides of the planet. Things got worse the week my mother had a bad reaction to one of the treatments and ended up in the emergency department. I spent 3 nights at the hospital in a row, barely going home except to shower and check on the twins, and even that felt like stealing time from her. The 3rd night, my back was screaming from the chair and my brain was just static. I remember finally sitting down with a vending machine sandwich, my phone buzzing nonstop in my pocket. It was my husband. The first message said something about how his day had been stressful. The second message asked if I had ironed his favorite shirt for some big meeting he had the next morning. I stared at the screen for a full minute, trying to process that he was asking about a shirt while I was literally waiting for a doctor to tell me whether my mother's organs were handling the medication. I typed and erased 3 answers before settling on something like, "I have been at the hospital for 3 days. The shirt is wherever you left it." He did not like that answer. He wrote back that he understood things were hard, but he also had a job and could not show up looking sloppy, that I was not the only one under pressure. I felt this hot, shaky anger rise up in me. I told him, probably less nicely than I am remembering it now, that he could figure out the shirt situation himself, because I had enough on my plate. He left me on red for hours. When I finally got home the next afternoon, he barely looked at me. The twins were on the floor with blocks. My father was at my place fixing something in the sink, and my husband was scrolling on his phone like we were all in some waiting room together. A week later, he came home with news. He waited until the kids were glued to a cartoon and my father had gone back to his house. He took a deep breath, the way he did when he was about to say something he knew I would not like, and told me he had applied for that position in the other state after all. He had done it a while ago, he said, and he had just gotten the call that they wanted him. He stood there in our kitchen, smelling like the cheap cologne he used on important days, and said it like he was announcing a win for both of us. I remember leaning against the counter because my knees genuinely did not trust the floor anymore. My brain went completely blank for a second. When I could speak again, I asked him if this was a joke. He said it was not. The offer was good, the money would be better, and we could really use that. I pointed out that my mother was hooked up to machines across town, and that I could barely cobble together childcare for the twins as it was. He said my father could do more, that there were services, that maybe my mother would adjust to a different schedule. That was our first real explosion. I told him he had gone behind my back during the worst months of my life to chase a job I thought we had agreed to put on hold. He told me he had to think about our future, and in his mind, waiting indefinitely for my mother's condition to improve was reckless. I accused him of being selfish and cruel, and he accused me of being controlling and of using my mother's illness as an excuse to keep him stuck. Those were his words. Stuck and excuse. I felt those words like a slap. At some point, he said he had already accepted the position. There was a start date in a few months. He had to move before us, set things up, and then, in his perfect scenario, I would follow with the twins once things with my mother calmed down, or once we arranged other care. I asked him, with my voice shaking, what he expected me to do if she did not magically get better on his timeline. He said maybe that was the point, that she was never going to get fully better, and I could not spend the rest of my life inside that hospital. I did not throw anything, even though I wanted to. I did not scream at the level my body wanted to. Instead, I sank into a chair, put my head in my hands, and cried in that ugly, gasping way you do when your entire sense of safety shifts. He said he was sorry it felt like a betrayal, but he could not let his career die. He said he still loved me and the kids. He was just trying to survive, too. I honestly do not remember how that night ended. Just flashes of him sleeping on the couch and me staring at the ceiling, listening to the twins breathing in the next room and wondering how I was supposed to hold all of this without breaking. A few days later, he moved in with his parents temporarily, which is what people say when they have one foot out the door, but do not want to look like the bad guy yet. He said he needed space, that we were only fighting when we were under the same roof, that it would be better for the twins to see less tension. He hugged them in the driveway and promised he would still be there for them, that nothing was changing between them and him, only between the adults. I stood by the front door, arms crossed against the chill, feeling like the adult in question had just turned into a stranger. We did not talk for almost a week after that. When he finally showed up, he did it with a proposal that sounded like it belonged in a spreadsheet. He said he would still take the job in the other state. He would move, we would stay, at least for a while. He would visit every other weekend, help with money, and once things stabilized, we could revisit togetherness. He kept saying the words for now like a bandage word, temporary, quick fix, not permanent. I wanted to scream that nothing about this felt temporary. Instead, I looked at the twins playing in the next room and thought about my mother attached to a pump and nodded like a coward who has no other options. We tried his plan. The first months were a blur of logistics. He moved. I stayed in our house with the twins, my job, my mother's appointments, and a car that sounded like it was threatening to quit at every red light. At first, he actually did the every other weekend thing. He would show up late on Friday, exhausted from the drive, hug the kids, bring them some small present from whatever gas station he had stopped at, and sleep late on Saturday. Sundays, he would leave around lunchtime so he could get ready for the week. I tried not to resent the fact that he considered sitting in a quiet apartment a form of preparation while I considered 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep a luxury. We would argue in whispers in the bathroom after the twins went to bed. I would tell him I felt abandoned. He would tell me he felt stretched thin. I would tell him my mother was declining. He would tell me his boss was demanding. Every conversation turned into this competition over who was more tired, who was more stressed, who had sacrificed more. We were both losing. It was around the 4th or 5th month that everything took on a different color. I was at home one evening, folding mountains of laundry while the twins built a fort in the living room, when my phone buzzed with a notification from a social media app I did not even use much. A woman from the neighborhood had sent me a message with screenshots attached. Her text said something like, "I was not sure if I should show you this, but I would want to know." I opened the pictures and felt my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with low blood sugar. There he was, my husband, in photos taken in some city bar, the kind with dim lights and fake classy glasses, looking 10 years younger and 0% married. In one picture, he was at a table with a group of men and women, smiling in a way I had not seen on his face in months. In another, he had his arm around a woman in a short dress, their heads leaned together like they had shared an inside joke. Underneath, some friend of his had written a caption about him, "Finally living a little." I sat there with a sock in my hand, trying not to throw up. The twins were laughing in the other room, piling cushions, oblivious to the fact that their father was very publicly pretending he was single. I texted him, fingers shaking, asking him what the pictures were about. It took him an hour to answer. When he finally did, his tone was defensive right from the first sentence. He said he was allowed to have a social life, that going out for drinks did not make him a monster, that I was blowing things out of proportion as usual. As usual. That phrase made me see red. I pointed out that the woman tucked under his arm looked very comfortable for someone who saw him as a purely platonic colleague. He responded that it was just a picture, that people posed, that I was paranoid because I had been stuck in hospital waiting rooms too long. I told him that while I was cleaning up vomit and managing medication schedules, he was out there taking shots and collecting phone numbers. He did not deny it. He just said we had been practically separated for months now, and he had a right to feel alive again. I wish I could say I hung up on him right then and there, but it was just a string of messages, no dramatic click. What actually happened is that I set my phone down on the table very carefully, like it was something that could explode, and went to tuck my kids into bed. Later, when the house was quiet, I went back and reread every word, letting it sink in that my husband had not just physically moved away. He had mentally checked out of our family and apparently started auditioning for his next act. Money became a problem around the same time. At first, he sent what we had agreed on. Then the transfers came late, then a little short. Then he started making comments on the phone about how things were more expensive in the new city, and he had to network and go out with colleagues. And their expectations were different up there. I tried to remind him gently that expectations down here included feeding and clothing 2 small humans, and keeping the lights on, and gas in the car so I could take my mother to the hospital. He sighed and said he was doing his best. The school called me one afternoon about one of the twins, saying he was acting out in class, snapping at teachers, refusing to participate, and crying over small things. They wanted a meeting. I tried calling my husband so we could talk about it as parents, and his phone went to voicemail 3 times. When he finally called back, hours later, he sounded annoyed that I had called repeatedly. I told him about the meeting, about our child's behavior, about how scared I was that the chaos at home was bleeding into their school life. He said he was in the middle of something at work and could not just drop everything. I asked him very calmly when exactly he planned to be a father instead of a guest star. He told me I was being dramatic. Our next conversation exploded because I pushed too hard on the money issue. I had been checking our shared card statement online. Yes, I know, snooping. But it was literally our shared account that was still tied to household autopay while we sorted out the separation, so technically I had every right to see where the money was going. And I saw charges that made my chest ache. High tabs at trendy bars, charges for a dating app's premium features, a couple of purchases at a clothing store that definitely did not sell anything in my size. I called him and asked, in that scary, quiet voice I get when I am beyond angry, what exactly we were paying for. He did not apologize. He did not even try to lie in a convincing way. He said something like, "Look, what I do with my money over there is my business now." I reminded him that there was no over there money and down here money. There was a family account and 2 kids who did not ask for any of this. He said I was trying to control him from a distance, and that was not going to work. When I mentioned the dating app directly, he laughed in this bitter way and said maybe he deserved to feel wanted by someone who did not spend every conversation talking about her mother's symptoms. That one hurt so much I had to sit down. The breaking point came on a weekend he was supposed to come visit. The twins had been counting down the days. They made a paper chain and ripped off links each morning, getting more excited as the chain shrank. My mother had been having a rough week, but I had arranged for my father and a home nurse to cover most of the weekend so I could actually be present with the kids and their father. I cleaned the house from top to bottom like I was preparing for an inspection. The twins drew pictures for him and put them under his pillow. The night before he was supposed to arrive, he called. His voice was too bright, the way it gets when he is rehearsing a speech. He said something had come up at work, something huge, and he could not make it that weekend. I did not say anything at first, just listened to the silence stretch so he would hear it. He rushed to add that he would make it up to them, that he would send them something, that they would understand. The twins did not understand. They cried themselves to sleep, and I lay in the dark, listening to their sniffles and wanting to throw my phone through the window. The next day, while I was at the hospital again because my mother had spiked a fever, I texted him about her situation, the labs, the fear that we were losing ground. I told him I could not do this alone, that I needed him to at least be emotionally present. He wrote back a single sentence. I can't do this right now. No explanation, no follow-up, just that. Something in me snapped. It was not a dramatic moment with me screaming in the hospital corridor. It was quieter than that. It was like a part of me simply stopped expecting anything from him. I still had responsibilities and appointments and kids and laundry, but the part of me that kept hoping he would show up and act like a partner just shut down. The next time he called, I kept the conversation strictly about the kids and the bills. Anything else, any attempt at talking about us, I redirected or ignored. He must have felt it, but at that point, I did not have enough energy left to manage his feelings. 2 weeks later, he showed up at the house with a folder in his hand and that same too bright voice. The twins ran to him, clinging to his legs, and he hugged them with one arm while clutching the folder like a weapon. Once they were busy in their room, he asked if we could talk. My stomach already knew what was coming. He laid the papers on the kitchen table like an offering and told me he did not think we could keep going like this. He said it was not fair to either of us, that we were living separate lives, that we were always angry, that he did not want the kids to grow up thinking this was what marriage looked like. Somewhere in there, he slipped and admitted that he also wanted the freedom to actually pursue the life he had started to taste in that new city. He said things like, I am wasting my best years, and we got married so young, and I never had a chance to see what else was out there. I asked him very calmly if there was someone specific already out there. He looked away and did not answer, which was answer enough. I wish I could tell you I threw the papers in his face. What actually happened is that my whole body went numb. I thought about my mother's fragile veins, the twins' nightmares, the unpaid balance on our utility bill, and realized that I did not have the reserves for a legal war. The papers were no contest. Basic custody arrangements, child support numbers that were not generous, but would keep us from sinking completely. I knew I could fight for more, but the idea of spending months in courtrooms and offices while my mother's time was literally ticking away felt like choosing the wrong battle. So I signed. I signed even though my hand shook and the ink smudged. He watched me, looking strangely relieved and vaguely guilty, like someone who had finally ripped off a bandage and was trying not to stare at the wound underneath. The divorce process itself moved fast. Faster than I expected. From the day he brought the folder to the day the judge signed off was about 3 months. Not the year-long battles you hear about. But every one of those weeks felt like it lasted forever. We did mediation, a couple of boring meetings where a neutral person wrote things down while we pretended to be calm adults. There was one short court hearing where a judge asked if we both understood what we were agreeing to, and I said yes, even though the only thing I understood was that everything I had counted on had turned into paperwork. When it was done, he called me the next day sounding lighter than he had in a year. He said he appreciated how mature I had been, how we had handled this like grown-ups for the sake of the kids. I remember looking at the phone like it had insulted me. By that point, my mother had started staying with me most weeks between treatments. It was easier to manage her medications and keep an eye on her symptoms. And honestly, my father still shut down when things got scary, so our house had become the default care center. My kitchen table stayed covered in pill organizers and appointment cards, but at least I could monitor her without driving across town 3 times a day. The twins were on the floor, drawing. My mother was asleep in the other room, and my father was fixing a broken cabinet door in the kitchen. I mumbled something polite and hung up, then went to the bathroom and cried quietly so nobody would feel like they had to comfort me. The months after the divorce were some of the longest of my life. I had to explain to the twins what was happening in small, age-appropriate pieces that still shattered them. One of them started waking up almost every night with nightmares about being left places, at school, at the grocery store, at their grandparents' house. The other one became clingy in this way that made brushing my teeth alone feel like a luxury trip. My mother's condition stabilized slightly but was still unpredictable, which meant the hospital trips slowed down but never stopped. My father and I developed a tag team routine where he would handle mornings and I would handle afternoons or vice versa, depending on my work shifts. At school events, people would look at me with this tilted head pity that I started to hate. Some of the other parents had seen my ex's new life online. Nobody said anything directly, but I caught whispers and quick glances. One woman pulled me aside to tell me she had run into him at a restaurant in the city, laughing loudly with a group and looking like a different person. She said it like she was complimenting his glow-up. I smiled and nodded and then cried in my car in the parking lot. My father was quietly furious. He did not yell. He just made these short, tight comments whenever my ex's name came up, about responsibility and character and people showing their true colors under pressure. My mother, when she was lucid enough, would squeeze my hand and say she was sorry, as if her illness had somehow caused my marriage to collapse. I had to keep telling her it was not her fault, even though a small, cruel part of me wondered if we would still be together if she had never gotten sick. I hate that thought, but I'm not going to pretend I did not have it. Life settled into this strange, tired pattern. Work, kids, hospital, sleep, repeat. I kept my position at the medical office, grateful for the insurance and the routine, even on days when listening to other people's health problems felt like salt in an open wound. My boss knew about the divorce and let me switch to slightly flexible hours when the twins needed me, which was the only reason I did not quit. My ex stuck to the arrangement on paper. He sent the support money, not always on time, but enough that I did not have to choose between electricity and groceries. He came to visit according to the schedule, though he sometimes cut weekends short for vague reasons. The twins learned a new normal where they had a house with me and occasional weekends with him in whatever new apartment he was renting. They stopped asking when we were all going to live together again, which hurt and also helped, if that makes sense. About a month after the divorce was officially finalized, he called me late one night. I almost did not answer. I was in bed, half asleep, with one twin sprawled across my feet and my phone buzzing on the nightstand. When I saw his name, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail and deal with whatever it was in the morning. For some reason, maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity, I picked up. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. He asked if I had a minute and then talked without waiting for my answer. He told me he had messed everything up, that he knew it now in a way he had not been willing to see before. He said that all the nights out, all the freedom, all the app dates and loud bars had started to feel pointless, like watching a show on mute. He said he would leave a place and feel emptier than when he walked in. He told me he had started having nightmares about the kids, about one of them asking why he did not love them anymore, about showing up somewhere and seeing them across a room and not being able to reach them. He admitted that his job in that other state was not as secure as it had seemed. There had been pay cuts, restructuring, talk of downsizing. The glamorous life he had imagined was actually a rented apartment with thin walls and a sink full of dishes, and no one inside it who knew him beyond surface level. Then he said the thing I had been half expecting and half dreading. He wanted to try again. He said he realized family was what really mattered, that he had lost sight of that he had been selfish and scared. He asked if I would consider getting back together. Maybe start by going to counseling, see if we could rebuild something for ourselves and the twins. While he talked, my chest got tight, not in a sentimental way, but in that how dare you way. I listened. I did not interrupt. I let him unload his guilt and fear and sudden clarity. When he finally stopped, there was a long silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end, waiting. Then I told him no. I did not say it dramatically. I just said it once, firmly. No. He started to argue, to plead, to list all the reasons we should at least try. He said we had history, that the kids needed a whole family, that he was willing to make sacrifices now. I reminded him, in detail, of the sacrifices I had made when my mother was sick, and he chose a promotion, a bar stool, and a stranger's attention over sitting next to me in the waiting room. I reminded him I had signed papers I did not want to sign, so I would not waste what might be my mother's last months in court. I told him about that message. I can't do this right now, and how it had sat in my stomach like a stone ever since. I told him that while I did not wish him misery for the rest of his life, I also did not owe him a soft landing from the consequences of his own choices. He cried. I do not say that with any satisfaction. It was awful to hear. He said he still loved me. I told him that whatever he called love had hurt me, and the twins more than any stranger could have. At one point, I said something I had never said out loud before. I told him that if he kept pushing for reconciliation, I would have to reconsider custody and ask a court to look at his instability. I did not say it while yelling. I said it in that quiet voice you use when you have finally decided where your line in the sand is. He begged me not to do that, not to take the kids away from him. I answered that I was not taking anyone anywhere. He had walked away on his own, and I had simply stopped holding the door open. After we hung up, his parents sent me a string of messages over the next few days, saying things like, "He is really not well," and "Can you find it in your heart?" and "The kids need both parents together." One message flat out said I was being cruel. I stared at those words and thought about every time I had carried their grandchildren alone, every juice box I had paid for with change from my coffee jar because the child support was late, every hour in that hospital chair with my mother. If cruelty meant not letting him waltz back in when he felt lonely, then I could live with being called cruel. The next time he came to pick up the kids for his weekend, he looked different. I mean physically different. Thinner. Dark circles under his eyes. Hair a little messy in a way that did not look intentional. He asked if we could talk for a minute without the kids. I hesitated, then agreed, because avoiding him forever was not realistic. And honestly, I was curious about what version of him was going to show up this time. We stood in the driveway while the twins buckled themselves into his car. He apologized again, but this time it sounded less like a performance and more like a confession. He admitted that his earlier "I want us back" speech had been partly about guilt and partly about panic over his own life falling apart. He said he had started therapy, that the counselor had pointed out how he always tried to jump straight from realizing he had hurt someone to demanding forgiveness, so he would not have to sit in the discomfort. He tried to say that we had both changed, that stress had turned us into people we did not recognize. I stopped him there. I told him I was done sharing the blame for decisions I had never had the luxury to make. He nodded, eyes wet, and for once he did not argue that. He said he wanted to move back to our area, even if it meant a smaller paycheck and a less shiny job. He wanted to be around for the twins' lives in a real way, not just as some weekend visitor. He was not asking for our marriage back anymore, he said. Just a chance to be a better father. I did not answer immediately. I told him I would think about it, not because I had any say over where he chose to live, but because I needed to decide how much access to my day-to-day life I was willing to give him again. I spent a week simmering on it. I talked to my father, who said that whatever happened between us as a couple, the twins deserved a father who showed up. I talked to my mother, who held my hand and said that she believed people could change if they wanted it badly enough. But that did not mean I was obligated to put my heart back on the table just to see if he would respect it this time. Eventually, I met him at a coffee shop near the hospital, neutral ground. I told him he could move back if he wanted, and that I would not stand in the way of him being more present with the kids. I also told him very clearly that whatever home he rented would not be my home, that we were done in that way. Our relationship going forward would be about co-parenting only. I used that exact phrase. I told him that if he tried to pull me back into emotional drama, love confessions, jealousy, or manipulation, I would tighten legal boundaries in a heartbeat. He looked hurt, but he also looked like he expected it. He said he understood. He said he did not have the right to ask for more. He promised to be consistent for the kids. I told him I would hold him to that. Over the next couple of months, he actually did it. He transferred to a position back in our region, a less impressive title and a smaller paycheck, but steady. He found a modest apartment not far from our house, a place with old carpet and weird cupboards, but one the twins quickly claimed as their second home. We set up a co-parenting app to manage calendars and communicate about school, health, and schedules, so there would always be a written record of agreements. My therapist's idea. And probably the best one she ever gave me. The transition was messy, of course. The twins were confused and hopeful and angry in ways that did not always make sense. One of them refused to hug him for the first few weeks, clinging to me and glaring whenever my ex walked in. The other one would run to him and then burst into tears when it was time to come back to my house. They tried to play us against each other sometimes, the way kids do, asking one parent for something and then asking the other when they did not like the first answer. We made mistakes in how we handled it, because there is no manual for this. But slowly, they adjusted. His parents changed their tune too. They invited me and the twins over for dinner one Sunday, the first time since the divorce. I almost said no, but the kids wanted to go, and my father encouraged me to accept for their sake. Sitting at that familiar table where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays felt surreal. His mother actually apologized to me. Not in some grand speech, but in quiet words while we were clearing plates. She said she was sorry for how they had pushed me, for how they had refused to see how much I was carrying. She admitted they had been more worried about their son's feelings than about the reality of what he had done. I did not give her some magnanimous forgiveness. I just nodded and said thank you, because at that point, acknowledgement felt like enough. He tried a couple of times to slip in comments about our old memories, like, "Remember when we used to bring the twins here as babies?" Or, "Sometimes I think about those early years." I shut those moments down gently but firmly. I would change the subject or remind him that nostalgia did not change facts. After a while, he stopped trying. I wish I could say that once I understood that, life suddenly started behaving itself, but you know that is not how anything works. Drawing a line with him and deciding I was never going back to that version of us did not magically make co-parenting clean or simple. It just meant that every new mess had to be handled without falling for the old patterns. We had our first big post-divorce holiday fight over a winter break. The agreement on paper was pretty clear, but he decided that since he was back in town and trying so hard, he should get extra time with the twins. His words, not mine. He wanted them for an entire week straight so he could take them on some improvised local adventure. I reminded him that we had agreed to split the break, that my mother would be devastated not to see them, that the kids needed stability more than they needed his grand gestures. He accused me, again, of punishing him by limiting access. I pointed out, in the co-parenting app where everything is charmingly documented, that I was following the exact schedule we had both signed in front of a mediator. It was the first time I used screenshots as a boundary, instead of just a way to torture myself. The twins started seeing a child therapist around that time, too. It was actually the school counselor who suggested it, after one of my kids burst into tears during a class project about my family. The therapist's office had soft chairs and a sand tray and shelves of little toys, and my kids treated it like some strange mix between a playdate and a test. The therapist told me privately that what they needed most was honesty and consistency. No big fake smiles, no pretending things never happened, just clear explanations and predictable routines. My ex bristled at first when he heard about it. He took it as a silent accusation that he had damaged them. I mean, yes, he had, but I reminded him that refusing help out of guilt would only hurt them more. Eventually, he showed up for a couple of sessions, sat in a small chair that was not made for his ego, and listened to his children tell him they were scared he would leave again. There were still moments when I almost slipped, like the night he was over 30 minutes late for a pickup and did not answer his phone. The twins were dressed with their small duffel bags by the door, checking the window every few minutes, asking if maybe he had forgotten. I told them adults sometimes get stuck in traffic, even though our town barely has enough cars to qualify as traffic. When he finally pulled up, he came rushing to the door with this breathless apology, something about a last-minute work thing and a call that ran long. Old me would have flooded him with my anger right there, listing every way his lateness had hurt the kids and me. New me sent the twins to the car and stepped outside. I told him he could not treat their time together like an optional meeting. I told him that if he was going to be late, he needed to say it before the pickup time, not after. He apologized again and tried to reach for me, not physically, but with that familiar tone, the one that used to pull me into arguments and emotional marathons. I did not engage. I stood on my own porch, arms crossed, and said, "This is about them. If you cannot respect their time, a judge can help you figure out your priorities." It was not a threat I wanted to act on, but I needed him to know that I was not bluffing anymore. He nodded, swallowed whatever speech he had loaded, and left. Around half a year after the divorce, I met someone. I was not looking. Honestly, the idea of dating made me tired. It happened because one of the nurses at the hospital introduced me to her cousin at a community event, a man who had also been through a divorce and had kids close in age to mine. He was quiet, kind of cautious in his body language, like someone who had been burned and was still getting used to holding his hands near the fire again. We started by texting about small things, then having coffee, then watching our kids play at the park while we awkwardly navigated the newness. His name does not really matter here. What matters is that he treated me with a basic level of respect that felt so foreign, I almost did not know what to do with it. He asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. He showed up when he said he would. He never made me feel like my mother's illness or my kids' needs were inconveniences. He understood, without me having to explain, that if my mother landed in the hospital again, dates would be canceled and sleep would be rare. The twins were unsure at first, which was fair. I did not introduce them right away. I kept him separate from that part of my life until I felt confident he was not just another temporary storm. When I did finally let them meet him, it was at a park, in broad daylight with ice cream and an escape plan in my pocket. He talked to them about their favorite games and asked them questions without forcing anything. Later that night, one of the twins said, "He is nice, but he is not my dad." And I said, "I know, and that is okay. He does not want to be." My new relationship was not some perfect fairy tale either. There was this expectation, in other people's eyes at least, that because my ex had been such a disaster at the end, the next man who treated me decently would automatically feel like a dream. Real life is not that simple. We had our own awkward arguments. The first time he canceled a date because his own child was sick, I felt this flash of panic that had nothing to do with him. My brain dragged up every time my ex had used work or being busy as an excuse, and I almost spiraled into assuming this new guy was going to disappear. 2. Instead of letting that sit and rot in my chest, I told him. I said, "Look, I know it is not rational, but this is what my brain is doing." He could have rolled his eyes or told me to get over it. Instead, he said he understood why my trust was shot, and that if I needed an extra text or two to feel grounded, he could do that. It was such a small, practical response, but it felt massive compared to the emotional gymnastics I had been doing for years. The first time he spent a full day with me and the twins, it was chaotic and oddly comforting. We went to a park, then a cheap diner, then back home to play a board game with half the pieces missing. The twins tested him on purpose. I could see it. They argued loudly, refused to share, asked him pointed questions about whether he was going to stick around. He did not try to be their instant best friend or their replacement dad. He just answered honestly, told them he was in their life because he liked their mother, and that the rest we would all figure out together. That night, after I tucked them in, one of them whispered, "He is weird, but in a good way," and I counted that as a win. When my ex found out I was seeing someone, he took it about as well as you would expect. He asked to talk one evening when he came to pick up the twins. We did not do the driveway talk this time. We ended up standing just inside the school entrance instead, under a wall of kids' paintings and crooked construction paper stars, which somehow made the whole thing feel even more surreal. He said he had heard from his mother that I was dating. I said yes, I was. He asked what the man was like, and I told him he was decent and kind and none of his business beyond that. He tried to play it cool, but his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was swallowing something bitter. He said he hoped I was being careful about who I brought around the kids. I said I was, and then I reminded him, without raising my voice, that I had taken care to protect the kids while he had been busy discovering nightlife in another city. He looked away and nodded. He said he was in therapy and trying to work through his jealousy and his tendency to make everything about him. I told him I was glad for him and that my personal life was still not his story to manage. The first time my new partner and my ex ended up in the same space was at a school event. Some kind of open house with kids' artwork taped to walls and tables full of cookies. My father came, my mother was having a better week and managed an hour in a wheelchair, my ex showed up, and my boyfriend came with his own kids. It was a circus. For about half an hour, I felt like a character in a show I had not agreed to star in. People looked, people whispered. You could feel the curiosity in the air. My ex walked over, greeted my father stiffly, nodded at my mother with this awkward combination of guilt and affection, and then asked to be introduced. The two men shook hands. It was not friendly, but it was not hostile either. Just two grown adults acknowledging that they both cared about the same children. I stood there, watching them, feeling strangely calm. It hit me that I did not have to choose between my kids' stability and my own happiness anymore. I had made choices, drawn lines, and somehow we had all survived it. Life kept moving forward in its messy way. There was another hospital scare with my mother the following year. I remember sitting in that same ugly recliner, the beeping machines, the smell of disinfectant, the déjà vu punching me in the chest. The difference this time was that when I texted my ex about it, his answer was not, "I can't do this right now." He said, "Do you need me to keep the twins an extra night so you can sleep?" And then he actually followed through. He brought them to see my mother when she was stable enough for short visits, stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, and talked to her about mundane things like the twins' science projects. My mother's health is still a question mark. Some days are good, some are not. I still have a little pharmacy on my kitchen table, just more organized now. The twins still ask hard questions and sometimes cry for reasons they cannot name. My ex is not a villain in their eyes, just a flawed person who hurt us but is trying to do better now. I do not romanticize that. I do not erase what happened. I also do not spend my energy wishing he were suffering somewhere. The truth is less dramatic. He is living with the consequences of his choices, just like I am. People sometimes tell me I am strong, which makes me want to laugh and also cry. I did not feel strong when I signed those papers, or when I slept in that chair at the hospital, or when I watched my kids wave goodbye from his car window. I felt cornered and exhausted and very small, but I kept going. One appointment, one late bill, one school meeting at a time. I learned how to say no without writing an essay afterward. I learned that I could love my kids fiercely, love my mother, and still refuse to set myself on fire to keep everyone else warm. And whenever I think for a second that maybe I was too harsh, that maybe I should have forgiven more or tried harder to glue something back together that was already in shards, I remember that text. I can't do this right now. I remember all the nights I did it anyway, even when I did not want to, even when nobody thanked me. That is when I remind myself that drawing a line is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the only way to stop bleeding. It did not erase the times he had failed me before. Nothing will. But it added a tiny layer of proof that he could at least be decent now, inside the boundaries I had set. I let myself appreciate that without letting it turn into some grand narrative about second chances. It is a weird thing, learning to accept help from someone you also refuse to take back. His parents had their own learning curve. Even after that quiet apology in the kitchen, old habits died hard. There were times his mother would make a small, pointed comment about my boyfriend, calling him the man you are seeing, in this careful tone like she was talking about a questionable pet. Once, when the twins came back from a weekend at their grandparents' house, one of them repeated something she had said about how real families stay together and work things out. I called her. I told her she was free to have whatever opinion she wanted about divorce, but she was not allowed to push guilt onto my children for something they had no control over. She cried, of course, and said she had not meant it that way. Maybe she had not. Maybe she had. Either way, the next time they hosted the twins, they stuck to neutral topics like school, pets, and weather, and I was fine with that. Eventually, my ex started dating someone too. The twins mentioned it first, casual and brutal the way kids are. They came home talking about the woman who brought the snacks and how she had a dog and wore very bright nail polish. My stomach did a little twist that surprised me. It was not jealousy, not really. It was more this complicated mix of protectiveness and, honestly, relief. If he found some kind of emotional distraction that did not involve trying to drag me back into our old mess, that could only help. We had a conversation about it on the porch one day. I told him I did not need or want details about his romantic life, but I did need to know who was spending time alone with my children. He agreed to introduce us in a neutral setting before she became a regular presence around them. The introduction was awkward, obviously. She seemed nice enough, nervous, clearly aware of the history she was walking into. I did not grill her. I did not warn her. I just watched how she spoke to my kids. She knelt to their level, listened when they talked, and did not try to bribe them with gifts. That was enough for me. There were still late nights when the weight of it all felt like too much. I would be sitting on the couch after everyone else in the house had gone to bed, the television flickering quietly with some show I was not really watching, and my brain would replay everything. The diagnosis, the text messages, the papers, the driveway fights, the school events with their weird social choreography. Sometimes I would catch myself stalking my own past, rereading old threads I should have deleted, looking for the exact moment things broke so I could convince myself I would see it coming next time. My therapist told me that there is no magic moment, just a collection of tiny choices that add up. She said healing is not about pretending those choices never happened, but about choosing differently now, even when your nervous system is screaming that familiar chaos is safer, because at least you know its rules. I hated how right she was, and also clung to it when I was tempted to answer one of my ex's longer, nostalgic messages with more than a neutral co-parenting response. So no, my life did not wrap up in some tidy moral lesson. There was no single day when I woke up and thought, yes, now I am fully healed. Thank you for coming to my inspirational talk. It was more like this slow accumulation of tiny, boring victories. Turning my phone face down during dinner and not checking to see if my ex had written something provocative. Saying no to extra shifts when my body was clearly begging for rest, even if the electric bill scared me. Letting my boyfriend see me ugly cry over something small because it had poked an old bruise, and not apologizing afterward for being too much. If there is any kind of happy ending here, it is not picture perfect. There is no neat bow. My life now is quieter in some ways and more complicated in others. I shared drop-offs and pickups with a man who once vowed to spend his life with me and then walked away when things got hard. I fall asleep next to someone new who knows my whole messy history and stays anyway. I hold my mother's hand while she naps in her chair and listen to my father rant softly about cable news. I sign permission slips and argue with insurance and show up at school concerts where I stand between my past and my present and clap for my kids like they are the main act, because in the middle of all this chaos, they are. Time kept moving, whether I liked it or not. The twins got taller, their faces shifting from round to angular in this sneaky way that made me stare at them sometimes like they were strangers who had stolen my babies. Homework turned from coloring sheets into actual projects that required glue and research and my broken printer. My mother had good months where she cooked small meals again, and bad weeks where just getting out of bed was a victory. My father finally accepted that therapy was not a scam and started seeing someone himself, which, honestly, changed our house more than any pill ever did. Co-parenting settled into something that almost resembled a rhythm. There were still offbeat moments, like when my ex forgot to sign a field trip form on his week, and I had to run across town on my lunch break so my kid would not be the only one left sitting in the classroom. We argued about it later, of course, because I was tired of picking up the slack in ways that never showed up on any legal document. He tried to blame his forgetfulness on work stress, and I reminded him that I had work stress, plus medical stress, plus single-parent stress, and somehow I still remembered to initial every tiny line on those forms. At the same time, I could not deny that he was different from the man who had walked out when my mother first got sick. He showed up at parent-teacher conferences even when it was not technically his night. He sat through boring school assemblies and clapped at the wrong moments and took pictures of the twins holding paper certificates. He did not flinch every time I mentioned a new medication or a side effect. Instead of shutting down, he would ask practical questions like, "Do you want me to take them this weekend so you can sleep after her appointment?" And then actually follow through. It was confusing, seeing that version of him coexist with the one who still lived in my memory, the one who had said he could not do this. My boyfriend became less of an extra and more of a main character in our everyday chaos. He learned the twins' inside jokes and the noises the car made when it needed a tune-up. He joked with my father about sports neither of them really watched, and helped my mother reach things from shelves without making her feel like she was fragile glass. We had our own rough patches, like the first time we discussed moving in together, and I realized my whole body tensed at the idea of sharing a space with any man again. We did not rush it. He did not sulk about my hesitation. He said, "I am not trying to replace anything. I just want to build something that does not require you to constantly brace for impact." That sentence made me cry harder than any love declaration could have. The twins noticed the differences too. One of them drew a picture for school where the assignment was, "My home," and he drew both houses, mine and their father's, with arrows back and forth. In the corner, he drew my boyfriend and labeled him, "the guy who makes us pancakes." When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "He is not like a dad, he is just like extra support." And I had to go to the bathroom for a moment, so I would not sob into his crayons. There were still triggers that caught me off guard. A random scene on a show where a wife gets blindsided by a move, a casual comment from someone about sacrificing for family, a hospital hallway that smelled exactly like the one from the night my husband told me about his job offer. Some days I handled it by taking a deep breath and letting it pass. Other days I handled it by ugly crying in the shower and texting my best friend a stream of half-coherent messages that she answered with heart emojis and, "You are allowed to be mad about it forever." You know, I used to think that healing meant I would stop being angry one day, that I would wake up and feel nothing when I thought about the worst moments. Now I think healing looks more like having room for other things alongside the anger. I can be furious at who my ex was back then, and also honestly grateful that he eventually stepped up for the kids. I can feel sad about the life I thought we were building together and also be genuinely happy when my twins come home excited about something they did with him, or with my boyfriend, or with my parents. It does not have to be one or the other all the time. So when I tell this story, sitting at my messy kitchen table or on my worn-down couch, I am not trying to ask anyone to pick sides. I am not here to nominate myself for sainthood, or him for villain of the year. I am just trying to lay it out the way it happened. The parts where I stayed too long, and the parts where I finally left. The pieces where I tried to hold everything together, and the pieces where I let some things fall so others would not. Because if there is anything I learned from watching my mother fight for every single day, it is that you do not get extra time just because you are polite about your own suffering. I am still that woman who kept going when someone told her they could not, but I am also someone new now. Someone who understands that loyalty without boundaries is just self-destruction with a nice outfit on. Someone who can sit across from her ex at a school event, pass him a program, and talk about their kids without secretly hoping his life has fallen apart. Someone who can hold her partner's hand in a grocery store aisle while her child throws a tantrum over cereal and laugh instead of worrying about whether she is being judged as a failure. I do not have some inspirational conclusion to give you. There is no neat sentence that wraps this all up with a lesson you can embroider on a pillow. All I have is this. I survived the version of my life where everything revolved around someone else's comfort. And now I am in a messier, freer version where my comfort actually counts too. The bills still come, the hospital still calls, the kids still fight over who got the bigger slice of cake. My ex still makes choices I do not always agree with. My boyfriend and I still argue about stupid chores. My parents still drive me a little crazy. But when I look around, even on the bad days, it feels like my life, not just something that is happening to me while I am busy keeping everyone else upright. And that, for me, is more than enough.